In this last module, we'll talk about deploying your ASP.NET Core application. We'll do this first by introducing gulp that will allow us to do some build time processing on some of our files. We'll prepare the code for production environments. We'll introduce environment tag helpers, and we'll deploy to a number of different platforms. So now let's start preparing our project for production by using gulp. Back in Visual Studio, we're going to start here by actually just creating a new file directly in the root of our project called gulpfile.js. This is just going to be a standard file that is going to require a project called gulp. Before we can do anything with the gulp file, let's open up a console and let's just type gulp. Gulp wants to find your gulp file and execute it, but it can't because it's missing the installation. So we're going to just type npm install gulp, just like it's suggesting. You may not get the suggestion because my machine may have gulp installed globally as well. So if you just cannot find gulp, do the same thing, npm install gulp. Now that it's installed and we type gulp, you'll see that it was able to run gulp. It found the gulp file, but it said task never defined. And so we're going to go ahead and define a couple of tasks that we want gulp to do for us. So back in Visual Studio, so we want to do a couple of things. We'd like to prepare and minify our JavaScript files. This is going to be our client-side JavaScript, not our Angular component. We also want to do the same thing for our CSS. And so to do this, we're going to create a function called minify. And this function is going to work with gulp to do this work for us. And so what we want to do here is actually say return gulp.source. And source is going to take one or more sets of source files. If you remember in our www root, we have this index.js that we have some code that we needed, right? We built this way, way, way back. We might add more to this as our project goes on. And so for the source, I'm going to give it an array with a single string in it. And what am I going to do? I'm going to tell it that I want it to look for www root /js /:/.js. And what this is really saying is find all files that end in JS in this folder, and this is saying or subfolder. This is telling it that we want to do more than one thing to it. Once we get those source files, we're going to essentially want to say pipe. This is a fluent syntax, and pipe is essentially going to say we want to take those files and send them into something. Where we're going to send them is gulp.dest, or destination, right? And so we're going to give it a folder name, www root/dist for distribution. We're saying take everything we've created and done here and spit it out into this distribution folder. But we want to do some things to it first. And so what I would like to do is say pipe uglify. We're going to need uglify require a package that goes with gulp called gulp uglify. Now we haven't installed this yet, so let's go install this. Back to our console, npm I gulp uglify. Added it. So back in Visual Studio, we can now tell it to do this. And this is basically a package that knows how to take and compress and minify all our JavaScript. But we're going to need one more here as well, which says, you know what, take all the JavaScript you find in that folder and subfolders and concatenate it into a single file. And this will probably come as no surprise. It's going to be from gulp concat. Again, you'll see a pattern of what it's calling these extension packages for gulp. And so let's head over into the console again, npm concat. Great, back in Visual Studio, we can then say pipe, which is just saying pass everything we've done before it into this third thing, which is going to be to say concat. And what am I going to concatenate them into? I'm going to concatenate them into Dutch treat.min.js. So I'm putting it in a min because uglify has compressed them all, and then I'm concatenating all the files that have been compressed with uglify into a single file and then spitting it out into this destination. Now that we have that, we can actually say exports default equals minify. So the default export of this file will be to just run the minify. So let's go back to the console, and if I've done this right and just type gulp, we'd see it found the gulp file, starting default, and set it finished. So what that should say is that if we look at our dist folder, we should have what? This one Dutch treat file. Let's go back to Visual Studio. Now that we have this dist folder, let's look at it. Oh, this is a concatenated version of that same file. Now this wasn't going to change variable names or some of the other things, but it did make it into the smallest possible version of the file we wanted. And if there was more than one file here, we could have done this for a number of files. Let's do the same thing with CSS. We can do this, and let's call it styles in this case. And we can do the same sort of thing. We're going to say gulp.source. And in this case, I'm going to say www.root/CSS, right? star.css. So this will include all CSS files that are in our Magic CSS folder. Again, we only have one. It doesn't have a lot in it, but this is not a bad idea, especially as your project grows, because we're certainly not at the end of this project. So let's do the same thing. We can actually use uglify, because uglify knows how to uglify both CSS and JavaScript. And then we'll pipe concat, just like we did before. But of course, this time we're going to do it in what? We're going to call it a Dutch treat.min.css instead, right? And then we'll say pipe gulp.destination. And where are we going to put it? www.root/dist again. Both of them will be in that same folder. So what we should have here is actually being able to run these separately. So we need to add as exports minify equals minify, and exports dot styles equal styles, right? So you could call these whatever you want. And by default, if we do nothing, it's just going to minify the files. I'll come back to that in a minute. Back in the console, now that if we do gulp, we see it's going to just run the default. But we could say gulp minify to just run the minify or the styles here, right? Because those are both ones we've exported and we'll know how to do it. But in reality, I don't want to actually just run minify here. What I'd like to do is run both of them on the default. And I can do that by saying gulp parallel and then give it multiple tasks. Now parallel says do them multi-threaded if possible, but if one relies on another, you can always do series as well, right? This is going to determine in what order that they happen. But for us, parallel will do the right thing. So back here, if we say gulp, we'll see it actually loaded it up and said we're starting these two finished. And you'll notice that this one took 52, this one took 53, but default on its own took 55 because these were being run in parallel at the same time to make them faster. And since we have these, we can actually use the Task Runner Explorer, which you may or may not have been able to include as an extension. But if you have, you'll have it here and you'll see gulp files included. And we can tell default to run after the build. So what will happen now? Every time we build this project, you can see in the output that it's going to go ahead and rebuild the actual project. But also in the Task Runner Explorer, we're going to actually see that it ran our gulp as well. So that every time we build this, we'll get a new version of these minimum styles. Though we're really only going to use these minimum versions for production. But this is going to guarantee that they go ahead and run for us when we're working in Visual Studio. We'll talk soon about how to get them to run when we actually do a deployment. But before we go there, let's talk next about how to use these in our layout files. So now let's use the environment tag helpers so we can decide when to use what files in our Razor pages. If we come back to Visual Studio, remember we want to use the files in the dist folder instead of the ones that we're using during development time, which we might be editing and adding a lot. So let's go down to our views and let's open up our layout. So if you remember, we have this link to the site and to Bootstrap in our header. And so we can add a tag helper here called environment around this. And notice it's colored a little differently because that's to point out that it's a tag helper. It's not going to be emitted in the markup. And what this environment tag helper says is included in what? In development. Remember that this term comes from what build style you're using. And so we can create another one for environment. And in this case, we're going to say exclude in development. We could also say include in production and staging and any other. But for me, I usually go ahead and just say for development, this is going to be for every type but development. So we often have two of these, one for while we're developing and one for when we're not developing. And so what are we going to do here? For now, I'm going to just bring the same bootstrap in. I could have this outside as well, but we're going to change those in a minute. And then I'm just going to grab our CSS and I'm just going to bring it in here, right? So during development, we're going to use that site CSS, edit it, we'll get it immediately. And for our distribution, we're going to use our created one here. And let's go ahead and add that other tag helper that we saw earlier, which was ASP append version, let's say equals true. And that's just to help us bust the cache versus the older versions of Dutch Treat when we make updates to our production machines. Let's do the same at the bottom. Remember, we're using all these different versions down here for jQuery, Bootstrap, Font Awesome, Solid, and then index.js. And so we'll do the same thing. We'll wrap this in an environment and include it in development. Now for another environment, then we'll say exclude in development. We're going to do something similar. I'm going to copy all of these except for, of course, our file, right? And I'm just going to grab our JS and bring it down there. And I'll do the same with ASP append version equals true, since this one may be changed. But the other thing we can do is actually make sure that we're using the min versions here of the other libraries, right? And this would be fine. We could even go and just use the regular jQuery here and use the jQuery min in development. And so if we just run this project, we can see our project is here, and if we look at the debugging settings, let's look at that network and do a rebuild, or a refresh I should say, and make sure, let's go ahead and say all, so we're seeing all the things we're downloading. And we'll see that the Bootstrap min jQuery, which is that unminified version, Font Awesome, Solid, and we're even getting that index.js here, right? And that's because currently we're running in development. Let's come back over here and let's just change it to production for a minute. And I'm just going to right click on the project and say properties. And under debug, I'm just going to change this, put a underscore under it so that this isn't going to specify that we're in development. It's going to assume that we don't even have an environment defined. Let's go ahead and run this again. We can see the page still works, but if we look at the downloaded files this time, what are we getting? We're getting Dutch Treat with that version number put in, we're getting the CSS with the version number put in, and we're getting all the other min versions. So it's deciding based on that development or production or even in staging which of those files to include. We can make this actually even a little better. Let's leave it for now in that non-development version so we can see how this works, because we can improve the way we're bringing in jQuery and Bootstrap as well. What we can do here is actually change this source to ASP fallback source. What this is saying is we're really going to use a regular source field here, and the source field is going to be a CDN to jQuery. Because so many pages use it, we're likely going to already have it loaded in our browser, so why not have the benefit of that? So if you remember, so we're going to try to find a jQuery CDN. And jQuery has its own CDN for its own file. So what if we want to use it, right? Let's say we want to use this latest version that we're using, which is 360, and we want the minified version. It's going to show us that the script tag we need is really this URL and these two attributes, right? And so what these are going to do is allow you to put in your CDN, not only is this the file we're looking for, but that the file hasn't been tampered with. So we're going to come up here before or after the fallback source. We're just going to paste those in. And then there's a last piece of what ASP.NET can do for you, and that is ASP fallback test. And what we're going to look for is window.jQuery. So this is going to be a little bit of JavaScript that it tests once this has been loaded from the CDN to see if jQuery exists. And if it doesn't, it goes and loads up your local version. So this is really just to enable, what if this CDN goes down, how do I go ahead and get and fall back to my original version of this? And we can do the same thing with Bootstrap. So let's come down here and put ASP fallback for source. And we'll also put ASP fallback test. And this will be, so what we're going to do here is window.jQuery. So the same test we were doing before, we just want to make sure jQuery has been loaded. And we're going to test for window.jQuery.fn, which is making sure that it has the extendable function loaded, and also to say window.jQueryFN.modal. Now, modal is something that's added by Bootstrap to the jQuery function so that you can use modal against jQuery. So this is just an elaborate test to make sure that Bootstrap has been loaded from our CDN source. So let's go find that CDN source as well. So Bootstrap has its own CDN as well that is pretty commonly used. And you'll see there's a couple of different versions here. And so we're going to grab first the JavaScript bundle. We're using the bundled version, so we don't need the other versions of it. And so let's go ahead and copy it. And then our source right here is just going to be that Bootstrap bundle, right? We don't need the integrity and cross-origin because those aren't actually being checked on this CDN. But we're also going to need to do the same thing up here for our CDN to get the min CSS. And so here we will just use, because the extensions here don't really work for the fallback because there's no way to really test against them. But in development, we're going to go ahead and use the CSS for Bootstrap directly from that CDN as well. So let's see if all this works now that we're using the CDNs. Come back here and let's go ahead and run it again. And we'll see it pulled the Dutch treats like we thought they would, but here it's getting the bootstraps from the CDNs and it's getting the jQuery from the cache. And the development tools here are turning off cache. Otherwise, you might actually see these 3 or 4 files, the ones from the CDNs, actually showing that they're just getting it from the local cache instead of grabbing it and downloading it each and every time. And that can really help us. These can be used all over to do things in development versus not development as well. So don't lay down on these. You can use these just like you might in other parts of your application. Now that we have the environment tags, let's go ahead and create our deployment scripts next. So now let's set up the deployment scripts. Back here in Visual Studio, we have an option when we hit right-click to publish our application, and we're going to be doing quite a lot of that in a minute. But we would like to be able to run some operations specifically if we're going to publish. Now remember, we may be publishing from Visual Studio here, or we may be publishing it on some remote build server. We want to make sure that the environment we're working in is correct. We may not even be building it directly using Visual Studio. So if we right-click and look at our CSproj file, now that we have the CSproj open, what we're going to want to do is near the bottom, is where I usually put it, but you can put it anywhere really, is create something called a target. A target allows us to tell MS Build that we want to do some things in a certain point in the build. I'm going to give it a name, just my published script should be good, and then I'm going to give it a before target. This is when to execute these individual operations, and I'm going to say before publish. So before we're ready to publish, we want to make sure that all of the source code and all of the deliverables are in exactly the state we want. So we're going to start by creating an exec object, and this just takes a command, and this is a console command. It's going to execute right before the publish happens. So the first one we're going to want is to install all the npm packages. And there's actually 3 of these, and we want to do them in this order, which is important, is we want to run gulp. That'll run all the default tasks in gulp. You could, of course, put other parameters here if you wanted to run individual things or change the order of the way gulp does things, but this should be what we want for our example. Now, it may not be apparent because of the way we created the gulp file, but there is a package.json in the root of our project now, not just in the client folder. So we actually have to run npm install twice, but what we're going to do here is say working directory is what? We're going to say client. And in that same way, we can then say ng build prod to build a production version of our project. And again, we're going to build it in that client directory, the same directory we're running that npm install as well. So now when we run a deployment, before the publish, but after the build, it's going to go ahead and run this npm gulp, and it's going to run our Angular build. We want it before the publish and not during the actual build cycles, because that would really slow us down while we're doing development. So this is only going to be really tested when you do a deployment, like we're going to do in the next couple of videos. Now that that's in place, let's go ahead and publish for our first time, but simply just to a directory. So now let's start by publishing to a directory. If we start with the project and go to the Publish option, it will show us several options: Azure, IIS, FTP, a simple folder, or import a profile from a cloud service. But we'll go ahead and use folder, and I'm just going to pick my desktop and just a folder I'll call pub. And let's go ahead and say publish. We can see those pre-publish commands starting here with npm install, gulp, and angular build. And it has succeeded, and we can see it here in that directory. Let's open up a console and go to that directory. And so we can see our application now has been published here. But if we do .NET run, it's actually going to fail. It said it couldn't find a project to run because it's looking for a project file. What we actually have to do is look for the project name DLL. That's the starting point for our project. So we'll just say .NET Dutch treat.dll. And you can see it's now listening on 5,000, and it is production because we haven't actually set that anywhere. So let's look at the browser. And we go over to the login. We'll see that it works as well. When we go to our shop, whoops, our Angular app is missing, right? Let's look at the debugging, and let's see what happened. All these files from Angular are missing. Why is it, you think? Well, let's go ahead and open up our folder, just in Explorer. Let's go to that www root folder, client, and all of our files that we're used to seeing in here have hash codes in them. This is meant to bust the caches. But for us, because we don't know exactly what this file name is going to be at the end, we're using another strategy to break that cache, right? And so we want to get rid of these hashes. So back in Visual Studio, we're going to want to open up that client directory and go to angular.json. And the way that the angular.json here works is as we go through, if you remember, we had all these settings. We changed our output path to here. Down below build, you're going to see this place called configurations. And production is one that changes some things in the way we're building them. And remember when we put the command to build this, we said ng build -- prod. So we'll go ahead and create the production environments. And so what we're going to do here is notice that one of them says output hashing all. And this is where it decides whether to put output caching. And we're actually going to change that to none. So let's go ahead and redeploy our project. And this will take a minute for it to actually regenerate. And back in the console, make sure you come over here and stop the build. Let's watch it quickly do this, though I'll speed it up for you. We can actually see here in the script for the publish that it created them without the extensions anymore. Once the publish is finished, back to running our project, and then let's go ahead and refresh our page. And now we can see it all working because it's now actually getting the corrected files. So we deployed this to a folder, and we can see this is actually working in the way we want. Login, shop is now working, and even the functionality, so you can see it actually working. By everything. We're running a production build of Angular as well as of our project. Let's do the same thing with Azure next. So now let's try publishing to Azure. In my case, we're actually going to publish directly to Azure Websites and Azure SQL. And we're going to pick a publish target. We're going to select an existing Azure web service. And assuming you've logged in, you'll be able to pick up subscription. And I'm just going to pick my Dutch treat site that I created earlier. And let's go ahead and just publish to that site. It's going to go through the same process that we did with file, but instead of copying to the folder, it's going to transfer them to Azure. So you can follow in the build all the preparation for the files, but you can also look at the web publish activity, and this will tell you what it's doing. And more importantly, when it gets to actually copying it out to the project, it'll then launch the website in Azure. We can see it's now running on the Azure website. And remember, I didn't tell it to not redirect to HTTPS, but one of the features of using the Azure websites themselves, not a custom domain, is that it supports HTTP or HTTPS. And so we're going to get that redirection and work just the way it should. So now that we're in Azure websites, let's go look at how to do this to IIS next. So now let's publish to IIS. We're going to start by opening IIS on the machine you want to. I'm going to assume you're going to deploy it on your local machine for now. What you're going to want to do is create a new website. And I'm actually going to just change the port since 80 is already taken by the default website. And I'm just going to call it Dutch Treat. And I want to change the application pool to an application pool that doesn't use the CLR at all, because we're actually using the .NET Core version, the portable version. You don't have to do this step if you've actually made the change and decided to use the full .NET framework. But for us, having no managed code is just better. And we need to give it a folder. And in our case, we could just point it at some place we were deploying manually, but that's not really that useful. Let's go ahead and use the inet pub directory. And let's just create a new folder for Dutch Treat. So we now have the second web server set up in IIS. And so back in Visual Studio, we're actually going to want to restart this in administrator mode. This means right-clicking it and picking Open as Administrator or holding down Alt, because we can't connect with IIS in user mode. It has to be in admin mode. So if we look at Visual Studio 2007, we can just run as administrator there. It'll make us verify it. And we can tell we're in admin mode because it actually says administrator here at the top. Once we do this, we can go back to our publish screen and let's create a new profile. This time I'm going to pick IIS and it is going to be web deploy, but this time I'm going to say the server is localhost Dutch Treat. I'm just going to give it a 81 and see if it can validate the connection. Tell it how we want to do it and say save. And let's go ahead and publish. And if we now go to localhost 81, so let's talk about deploying with the command line tools next. So now let's use the command line to do the publish. There may be cases where you want to do builds at the command line or with scripts instead of actually using the full Visual Studio. And if you look at the command line, you'll remember that .NET allows us to do things like build and run, but it also lets us do publish. Publish is going to allow us to do build and publish just like we did in Visual Studio, but directly from the command line. And there's a number of options here. I'm not going to belabor too much, but let's try this easiest one, which is .NET publish-o for output. And let's put it on the desktop as a new publish destination. So you can see this is using the Microsoft Build engine, which is MS Build, and then first building the project. And then even though it's not showing you the command structure like we saw in the output, we are seeing up to date, which is the Bower. Here is the gulp run, and then it's going to start doing and outputting the Angular build, and it will now finish, say, great, we're done. So let's go to that directory. We're going to get the same thing we got before. So we can now say .NET Dutch treat.dll. And there we go, running after a command line. So one thing that's more commonly done with the command line than with Visual Studio. Let's do that next. In .NET Core, there's a special identifier called INRID, or a runtime identifier. It's used in a couple of different places, but it's really important to ASP.NET Core. We can see the different kinds of Windows, Linux, and OS X versions that the .NET Core runtime works on. So there's a Win 10, a Win 8, and a Win 7 in Windows, and then in Linux you can see a number of different kinds of distributions. Where I have the pound signs, that is to refer to specific versions of those operating systems. Linux Mint, Ubuntu, OpenSUSE, Fedora, etc. And then you'll see several versions in OS X as well. You can follow this sean.me/core-rids to go to the latest list of all of the runtime identifiers if you really want to match up purposefully. And these runtime identifiers become important because we want to be able to publish our application with the runtime sometimes. So let's see what this looks like. So back in Visual Studio, even though we're going to use the command line, If we look at the properties of our project, we can say that it's a .NET Core application, but it's difficult for us to say what versions of the runtime or what runtime identifiers we want to support in building. So instead, we need to look at the CS proj. So we can use something called a runtime identifier to tell it what version of the runtime we want to actually use. And I'm going to use the Win10 64-bit version of the runtime. And by doing this, if I open back up the command line, I can use the .NET Publish to pub2 again, but I can actually say self-contained. And this is 2 dashes. Let me put an extra space in there so it's really obvious that it's self-contained. And if we go back over to that pub2 directory, things have changed a little. We've got all of the runtime that we need. These are all the assemblies that are required to run this application completely separate from the operating system. And one of the things you'll see if we go up to Dutch is there's now a dutchtreat.exe. So it doesn't require the command line there at all. We can actually just say dutchtreat and it runs, just like if we were running it from the command line. And so this can be very useful if you need different versions of ASP.NET Core separate in different silos of an application. This way you don't have to version every application when you're going to upgrade the .NET Core version on a particular machine. This does not work if you're going to target the full .NET framework because there is no way to package up the full .NET framework. This is one of the features that's important in .NET Core. I mentioned this briefly early in the course. What if you wanted to support more than one? In that case, you would change runtime identifier to identifiers, and then you could add extra identifiers, comma delimited. So we could say osx.10.10-x64, which is one of the Apple runtimes. And then instead of saying self-contained, we would say runtime, and then the runtime we want to actually publish. I'm going to put this in a different directory, and then I can just say runtime, and then give it the runtime I'm looking for. In this case, we're going to say osx.10.10x64. And the runtime name here is case sensitive, so don't put OS10 in capital letters to make sure it's in lowercase. If I go to the new pub3, I'll see a similar directory because the whole runtime is being included. But if we come up here to Dutch treat, you'll see there's a Dutch treat that actually doesn't have an extension because that's what we would run on a Mac. And this would run if I copy this directory onto a brand new Mac of the right version, and it would start listening for our application's requests. So the power of being able to deploy with the application is really useful in a bunch of environments. This especially is true in the cloud, where you may want to include everything in your application directly inside a container or a virtual machine without having to do a lot of setup on that virtual machine. Let's wrap up this course. So what have we learned? I showed you in this module that Gulp can help you simplify some of the processes you're going to want to run preparing for deployment. I've shown you some techniques for readying your app for deployment so that when you go ahead and deploy it to different situations, you'll be ready to only send in the files that are absolutely necessary. I've also shown you how to deploy to IIS, to the cloud, and locally to just a direct. And if you've gotten this far, really thank you. This has been a long course and you've stuck it out. Quite an accomplishment, and you should be really proud of yourself. You've created an application from scratch. You've gotten the keys of what you need to learn to be able to build your own applications. Thanks again. Directory.